Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective, bringing you analysis, reviews, and fun from a Christian nerd's point of view. Today, I'm going to follow up from my last video where I was talking about updates to the King James Version, and I'm going to look at whether the King James Version is easy to understand. So in my last video, I talked about different updates to the King James Version, like the King James 21st Century, the King James Version 2016, the KJV ER. These are just different additions that have been made in recent years to try to make the King James Version available and accessible to modern readers. But some of the feedback from that video in the comments was that some people think that the King James is easy to understand. They think that people are overstating how hard it is to understand. And it's interesting because I have definitely heard some people say that when they read the King James Version, they think it is really hard to understand. And then I've also heard other people say that they read the King James Version and they don't have a problem with it. And of course there are people who've grown up with it that find it easy, but even people that they've picked up the Bible in more recent times, or maybe English isn't even their first language, they find that the King James Version is understandable. So it's a really interesting question. Is the King James Version easy to understand, or is it hard to understand? And really, I think the answer to this is that everybody's different. And so it's going to be harder for some people, it's going to be easier for other people. I will say, though, that there is a sense in which I agree. Sometimes people write off the King James Version as just being too hard to understand because it's in older English. But you know, it's true that if you take the time to read it regularly, you will get used to the pacing of it, the vocabulary, the syntax, the order of the words. You will get more used to it. And so for many people, it's not impossibly hard to understand the King James Version. However, we do have to acknowledge, like I was saying yesterday, that there are groups that are putting out updates of the King James Version that are trying to clarify certain words for people today. And some of these groups are actually, I would say, fundamentalist groups. So if even the most conservative fundamentalist type of Christians who are either King James only or very close to King James only are updating the King James, I think that says something to how hard it is for some people today to understand. And there's no doubt that language is slowly but surely changing over time. So it would be interesting that if someone picked up a King James Version in the 1600s, how would they hear it, and how easy would it be to understand? How different would it be from the language that they normally use when they speak English compared to the 1700s? And then the 1800s. And I know from just reading literature from the late 1800s and early 1900s that English and literature has changed in the last 100 years. So because of that slow and steady change, it is becoming harder and harder for people to really understand fully the King James Version. And that's a real point that I want to make here. It's not that you can't understand it at all. In a general sense, you can pick up something like the King James Version in other Old English literature, and you can understand the general sense of what's being said. It's more the specifics, though. It's when you get into the details that you might really, as a reader, start to say, okay, I understand a lot of what I'm reading, but there are certain places where I'm not sure I understand that. And so what I find is when I read modern English Bibles, I actually realize that there were certain things I didn't even notice that maybe in the King James Version, I kind of had a general understanding of it. But now when I read a more modern rendering of that, I can fully understand what's being said. And so for those details, it really helps to have a modern version. And I'll give you some examples of this. And a lot of this has to do with words, as I've talked about, that for an English speaker, you think you know the words, but you don't really understand how those words were used at the time of the King James translation. And so let me give you some examples here. In James 5:11, in the Authorized King James Version, it says, "Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. So when it talks there about seeing the end of the Lord and that the Lord is pitiful, those are phrases that we understand them if we speak English, but the problem is for a lot of people, we misunderstand them. The Lord in no way is coming to an end, and God, as we use the word pitiful, is not pitiful. So if you look at a definition here of pitiful, it says deserving or arousing pity. And then another definition, very small or poor, inadequate. That is not a good description of God. But that is how we use the word today. But look at the archaic definition, compassionate. So it is the idea of someone who has pity. And God does have pity for those who are in need. He is compassionate. So in that sense, the Lord is pitiful. But that's not how we would say it. So look at the New King James Version. It does say that you've seen the end intended by the Lord. Okay, so that added word there just clarifies what end means. It's the end, the goal intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. So the word compassionate is much clearer to readers today. And again, if you read that verse, you might say, okay, I understand what's being said there. But for a lot of people, they would miss the nuance of meaning when they get to that word pitiful, or they might misunderstand it. It certainly might stand out to them. They might be reading that and go, why does the Bible call God pitiful? But the New King James, that modern rendering, clarifies that. So I think that's a good example. Another example is Philippians 1:27. Where it says, only let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ. So what does that mean to an English speaker today? Let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ. And I have to say, as an English speaker myself, if I wasn't familiar with the King James Version, I would look at that and say conversation means the way that I talk. And becoming, I'm not sure. I think someone might be able to figure out how the word is being used there, but a lot of times when we talk about becoming in English, we're talking about something transforming or going towards something, right? Becoming something. But that doesn't seem to make sense. So is Paul talking here about the way that we talk? Becoming the gospel? What does that mean? So if you compare that to the English Standard Version, it says, let your manner of life instead of conversation. And that's what the word conversation meant to the King James translators. And then it says, be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Okay, so the idea is something that is becoming of, right? It's fitting for, worthy of. And so the English Standard Version clarifies that. Also, it says at the end of the verse in the King James, that you stand fast in one spirit. Again, we understand those words generically if we're English speakers, but standing fast is just not something that we say or use today. And in the English Standard Version here, it says standing firm in one spirit. And that just clarifies there, because that word fast, we think as English speakers typically as someone moving quickly, whereas there it's talking about being firm. And so that clarifies it. Now, can you figure these things out? Yes, in some cases you can figure them out. But the point that I'm making is that for typical English readers, these are details that often get overlooked. And so you might have a general understanding of what the Bible is saying, but a lot of times you misunderstand or are not clear on the specifics of what certain verses are saying and what certain words mean. And so updated and modern renderings of these verses are really helpful to a lot of people. And let me also make a comment about people that are second language readers, because sometimes that's an interesting point that people make, that, well, I am a second language English speaker and I find that I can read the King James Version. And that's cool. That's really interesting. But some thoughts came to my mind about that. First of all, people that our second language English speakers and readers obviously are people that have the intellect, and they also have the drive and the effort that they're putting into learning language. So because they have that mental capacity to understand different languages, I could see that they would be able to read the King James. But a lot of people that only know one language, it's hard enough for them to understand their own language. And so that's something to keep in mind, that an English speaker might actually find it harder to read the King James. And another reason would be that if you are a second language English speaker, then you're not as locked in with how you hear certain things in English. If you're a native speaker, when you hear certain words, like some of the words that I talked about there, you're used to hearing them a certain way. And the way that we phrase things, if you're a native English speaker, you're used to hearing them a certain way. So it's actually harder sometimes to adapt to something it is your language, but it's not exactly your language. Whereas if you're not a native English speaker, sometimes the King James Version might actually be worded, and the order of the words might be more what you're used to in your native language. And so in some cases, it's actually easier for a second language English reader to read the King James than a native English speaker. And I know that sounds crazy, but let me show you an interesting passage. And I'm curious, if you're a second language English speaker, how hard you think this passage is to understand. In Romans chapter 7, verse 15, Paul says, "For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then it is no more that I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. For the good that I would I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me." Now I can tell you as a native English speaker that is not at all the way that we would put things. That it's just not the order of the words, and it's not the use of the words. But it's possible, if you're not someone who grew up with English from the time that you were a baby, you might be able to figure that out better, because you're not locked into how certain words should be used and the order of those words. So I think just in terms of how flexible we are in our understanding of English, it's interesting that sometimes people that are using English as a second language actually find it easier to use a version like the King James than a lot of native English speakers. So that's just an interesting point that I think is good to think about. But anyway, I realize everybody's different. So in saying this, I'm generalizing. There are a lot of native English speakers who can perfectly well understand a lot of the general ideas in the King James Version, and they can look up words that they don't understand, and they're probably pretty good at picking out even some of those words that we call false friends that are being used differently today in our language than how they were used during the time of the King James translation. So some people can figure that out just fine, and generally they don't have a hard time reading the King James Version. For me, I'm more that way because I grew up reading the King James Version. I do encourage people to read it for themselves because I think it has such a heritage to it. I think it has such a beauty to it. It's obviously a classic piece of English language, and it's very important to our Christian heritage as English speakers. That being said, I think there are good reasons to use other versions along with the King James Version, and I think with what I talked about today, you can see that. So, is the King James Version easy to understand? Well, it really depends on the person. I would say that I think everybody is capable of reading it regularly and getting a better understanding of it as they get used to it. But let's face it, some people are going to find it really pretty easy to understand. Other people, I've heard this, really find it difficult to understand, and that's because we're all different. But at the end of the day, I think it's a good translation to have and to read. But I would say also reading other translations that are very clear in our language today are good as well. So those are my thoughts on whether the King James Version is easy to understand. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for listening to what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.